Sebastian Copeland, thank you for participating in Climate Action Live.
Jeremy, it's a pleasure to be with you as always.
Sebastian, you're a polar explorer, climate advocate, photographer, author. Could you tell us about your latest works and your missions?
Yeah, listen, I mean, I've managed to thankfully and luckily really be able to combine my various passions, which has been anchored in geology and earth sciences and then glaciology and exploration in the polar regions. And then I'm handy with a camera, so I'm able to combine these skills. And then lately it's been really about analysis, global systemic analysis of different systems as they all conspire to define what it is to be human in the 21st century. So I like to think that much of climate is predicted by what happens in the polar regions, and so I've made it my life's call, if you will, to focus on these parts of the world.
Just briefly to touch on that, why are the polar regions, such a sort of an interesting space for you to explore? What's that relationship with how the big picture looks?
Well, look, I mean, I think it's very easy to identify very minute changes in climate when you look at ice. If you look at more moderate latitudes or more extremely warm latitudes, the variations in increments or in fractions of degrees tend to not be that visible. Whereas if you shift, if you've got variations in temperature of small increments in an area that's defined by the transformation of liquid H2O into a solid, when you visually can actually record and testify to that transformation, I think the message is much easier to communicate. It's also what we call the canary in the coal mine. So it gives you a harbinger of what's to happen. In my field, we always say, if you want to know where the world's going to go in 30 years, look no further than the poles.
It's June 2024. I want to ask you, Sebastian, what's your assessment of the current situation in relation to our journey of protecting our planet and people?
Okay, well, you ready for this? I mean, look, we've got record high emissions in 2023 from fossil fuels, which have reached a new high exceeding 40 billion tons, nearly 37 billion tons from fossil fuels alone. This represents about a 1.1% increase from 2022 and about a 1.5 increase since pre-pandemic levels. So that's not good. It indicates essentially a continued upward trajectory despite global efforts to mitigate climate change. But there are some notable shifts, notably in the Western world or in the developed world, if you will. Emissions in the US, for instance, decreased by 3% in 2023. I've just read that in France, they decreased by 5.6%. And so generally speaking, we can see that in the developed countries, at least, where we're starting to see a result to a very proactive campaign of using renewable energy sources and to try and decarbonize. So that's a positive. With that said, there is still an emissions gap. Essentially the disparity between current emissions and the trajectory or targets that were set by the Paris Agreement in 2015. And so where we're at presently is we're headed towards 2.5 to 2.9 degrees increase relative to pre-industrial levels, which is not good considering we're looking to stabilize them at 1.5 degrees. So while there have been some positive developments, such as decline in advanced economies and increased investments in clean energy, the overall global energy picture for 2025 indicates that much more needs to be done to meet international climate targets.
1.5, to the person who doesn't understand the 1.5 that you're talking about, which is the level that we need to stay at, could you just illuminate for those who don't really know, including myself? I mean, there's lots for me to learn around all of these issues. Talk to us a little bit about the 1.5 and why that's so important.
So, Industrial Revolution, 250 years ago, we start to understand that carbon molecule is going to be very productive in generating energy and therefore increasing our output in production, generally speaking. So output in terms of quality of life, electrification. I mean, at the time it was coal and then gas and then fuel, but the use of carbon as a means of generating power. And this has been really good for civilization. Let's be clear, this transformation towards a optimization of our quality of life, our output, etc., has been positive in the development of the human species. With that said, it's gone into an excessive mode of emissions. And what that's done is that the very thin layer of atmosphere that essentially protects, envelops the Earth and has created a system, a biological system that has promoted life starting about 581 million years ago, and an explosion of all types of different organisms, multi-cell organisms, and from fish to amphibian to reptiles and birds and mammals, and then trees and flowers and everything that we love about our planet. Well, this little envelope of atmosphere, which is essentially oxygen, carbon dioxide, hydrogen, argon, and water vapors, essentially has generated this little envelopes that has enabled us to thrive. There is a threshold where life can be sustained within that envelope. And throughout the course of these 541 million years, there's been cycles, and that these have to do with the elliptical course over the sun, which shifts every 100,000 years or so. It's called the Milankovitch cycle. And so when we see shifts in climate going, warmer and cooler, so what we call the greenhouse cycles or the house cycles, these are essentially a reflection of these slight variations. What we're witnessing in this age is a rapid acceleration that has no historical precedence when we look at carbon dating, ice core samples, etc. So within just the last 40 years alone, we've seen a dramatic increase in emissions, so in the concentration of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and as they relate to a rise in global temperatures. So that 1.5 degree that we're addressing is essentially where life was in pre-industrial terms, actually as defined by 1880. So not even that far back. But in 1880, we had a certain threshold of temperature, which was manageable for the thriving of all species, including ourselves on this planet. We have defined at the IPCC locally, notably the international, body of the UN, which comprises thousands of scientists, have all sort of essentially reached the conclusion that 1.5 was the target that we should not exceed in terms of global temperatures. And so when I'm talking about an increase that presently is on trajectory of reaching 2.5 to 2.9 degrees, this is almost double what those targets were. So not a good picture.
Wow, amazing. It's really fascinating to hear you give that explanation, and to somebody like me, it's really illuminating. Thank you, Sebastian.
My pleasure.
I'd like to ask you about a phrase: no climate action, no peace. Could you talk to me about what you think when you hear that statement?
Yes, listen, that really sums it up. the thing we tend to say that climate change has no passport, and that's really true. In spite of the fact that some regions are suffering much more than others, depending on which latitude you live in, your life may change dramatically. For instance, we've lost about 1% of inhabitable lands to a warming climate, meaning that where people could thrive. We've seen both vegetation, insect life, animal life, and humans migrate away from these regions. And by 2070, we'll have reached about 16 to 17% of land loss, habitable land loss to climate change. What does that mean to peace? Well, one of the things that we need imperatively to talk more about in this world presently is famine, right? This is we've got a lot of discussion centered on human rights issues in Gaza presently, where and the famine that it generates because food has been weaponized. But in Sudan, we're undergoing presently what is likely going to be the largest famine event in modern history. And this is really, really staggering in 2024. 18 million people in Sudan are facing acute starvation, and 7 million of them in South Sudan, 3 million of them in Chad. In Nigeria, there's essentially 26 million people who are facing acute food shortages. And it's very, very likely that we'll see up to 2 million people die of famine in 2024. How does this relate to peace? Well, aside from the fact that, just on a moral issue alone, this is totally unacceptable, considering the excesses of wealth that is being displayed throughout the world. But people who are struggling in regions where they can no longer live are obviously, just like animals, insects, and biology are doing, are migrating to other places that are more welcoming to life. And in the case of humans, because we've created these artificial boundaries that the natural world doesn't recognize, and these are borders, we're now generating a geopolitical instability and a certain cultural threat in other latitudes, right? Countries like our Western countries, needless to say, and the US as well, where we see this massive sort of rise in populism that is really anchored and in fear, right? People are fearing that they will lose their culture, they will lose their jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So this is actually reshaping the nature of sociopolitics and generating both a fractious environment for societies to develop and a very, very polarized, unpeaceful context there as well. So on the one hand, you have the really stressed regions that are fighting for access to water and agriculture and food. And on the other hand, you've got these populations that are pushing into regions that are more prosperous and potentially more promising for their future, but destabilizing these environments and creating alliances that generate extremes as well. So, food, climate, all of these aspects are determinant factors to the disruption of peace. So in solving the climate crisis, we are, by the same token, taking a big chunk out of the challenges that we face in establishing global peace.
So, given what you've just said, the global crises that are unfolding, do you think we have the ability to unite, to stand together in order to be able to resolve these fundamentally important issues?
Well, look, I don't have a crystal ball any more than you do. What I do know is human nature, and human nature is essentially split between two opposing factions. One of which is greed, and the other one is compassion. And to a large extent, I think humans are really defined by these two sort of opposing forces. Which one will prevail in the context of this discussion is really anybody's guess. Do I think that that humankind has the ability, the potential, the acumen to solve this climate crisis? Absolutely. We have the ingenuity, we have the tools, we even have most of the technology presently. And the one that we don't have, clearly, we have the capability of addressing and implementing. What is missing is, I think, is generally a global and popular will. And with that, I'll address the three actors of transformation, which is the public sector, lawmakers, politicians, elected officials, the private sector, special interest, businesses, stakeholders, and of course the consumers, which by the way includes the media, right, as a communications tool. So I always say that these three actors of change are shackled at the ankle, and one can only move as fast as the slowest one. So the idea is to somehow figure out how do we move in concert so that we can accelerate this process of change, which incidentally is happening. We are doing much better globally in terms of our awareness than we did, say, 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. The discussion has reached not just the kitchen sink discussions at home, but the school courtyards as well in many places. Teachers, instructors, all of these very, very important aspects of society are on board for the most part. But we also live in a polarized environment where somehow the lowest hanging fruit is often what people seek for reasons that are well understood. And this is where we need the private sector to pick up the slack, and the elected officials to stay reasonable, which I'm saying this with a pause, of course, because it's a pregnant pause, because we all understand, how this may or may not evolve in that direction, or devolve in the opposite, if you will.
Thank you, Sebastian. Finally, I want to ask you, if people would like to support you and the work that you do, how can they best do that? Where can they find information?
Okay, thank you for that. Look, here's what, Jeremy. I'm going to say, if people want to support me, here's what they can do, is that they should be curious, above and beyond. Sure, you can go to Copeland Adventures on Instagram, or find me on social media. I've got a foundation. I consult. I work with brands and with governments. But really, where we're at presently is, to quote Marshall McLuhan, there are no passengers on Starship Earth, that we all crew, right? Everyone needs to pick up the slack, because the greatest danger in climate change is this idea that somebody else is going to resolve it for us. And this is essentially this minefield, because we all have priorities. But transformation happens globally, systemically, because everyone is on board. Again, it's this sort of shackled at the ankle that I addressed earlier. So if you're purchasing a new vehicle, come on, do us a favor, purchase electric. If you're driving an old clunker that's emitting these clouds of gas, retire the damn thing. Get a bicycle, an electric bicycle, if it were. Get involved in sort of representing your constituency, in as far as your right to vote. You're privileged to vote, and express yourself that way by supporting people who are visionary and not dinosaurs. I mean, these are the ways that you can support me, and incidentally, it's a gift that keeps on giving, because that's the way you can support yourself.
Sebastian Copeland, thank you for today, and good luck on your next mission.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. It's been a pleasure.